It's my pleasure to welcome you back once again to Zokunushrir, Sieged Quakes, a powerful fortress filled with both hill and mountain dwarves, human and Aarakocra immigrants, and one universally beloved Azer Mayor. We have been besieged seasonally by murderous orcs, our prosperous economy and in-demand exports crippled by these lawless, ethically despicable creatures. I mean, in order to get here from the rest of the world, you had to go all the way around this huge mountain range or this obnoxiously shaped gulf, only to then be ruthlessly assassinated by some pathetic band of brutes, literally just waiting outside our fort for this exact thing to happen. Not really great for tourism. But I had a feeling that this wouldn't bother us for that much longer. After years of diligent work, the pit was finally completed. The goblin pit, the orc pit, the whatever dared to enter our fortress pit. It was a staggering 48 Z levels deep, lined with cobaltite and smoothed out at the bottom to discourage anything from climbing out. At the bottom of the access stairwell, I had carved a small chamber so a squad of dwarves could form up and take care of anything that survived the fall. However unlikely that was to happen. Our fortress got a brief royal visit of sorts when I showed off my conquest of the orcs to my mother. Nice. Alright, let's see what happened. Mission report. Took many days to cross in winter. That's probably why it took so long. Okay, we did a bunch of murder. We did much murder. We did lots and lots of murder. And we rampaged throughout Esteem Buried. And then we came back home. Partially by boat, curiously. Even though they don't exist in Dwarf Fortress, but I guess I'll take it. Now that the pit was finished, I only had to wait for a reason to use it. Seasons passed. Some new migrants arrived, despite the danger that the orcs posed, and I went through this again. But time passed steadily and not a single orc was actually sighted near the fortress. Maybe they had finally given up. Maybe they picked too many fights that they couldn't handle. Or maybe our own offensive efforts were making an impact after all. I mean, that would be nice, but I still felt like after 13 years of build-up, I really deserved some payoff. Duck. Duck Fortress. Holy shit, there's so many of them. We got an enormous migrant wave in the spring of year 113. But even more importantly, we got a siege. I called everyone inside and made a quick sweep of the map for anyone still out wandering around. These orcs hadn't brought war animals and didn't really seem in much of a hurry, and all the better for me as I still had some new migrants that I hadn't stuffed into armor and handed a weapon yet. Hopefully they wouldn't need it, but you could never be too careful. We could be too late pulling the lever on the pit, or maybe the orcs could have some tricks up their sleeve. Maybe they'd heard news of the pit's construction and trained to be legendary climbers like some shitty orc karate kid or something, who knows. We let them come inside, through an ominously empty surface tower, over a battlefield strewn with used crossbow bolts, various dead orcs' armor, and rotting body parts. This probably should have thrown them some red flags, but maybe all they saw was an empty fortress. Free loot. I had raised the drawbridge that accessed the pit and made the orcs go the long way around, and I locked the door that accessed the pit floor. As they creeped over the pit, they had no way of knowing what was coming. They crossed the threshold, and I told the dwarves to pull the lever. One agonizing moment later, it happened. I tried to follow the orcs as they fell down, but it happened so fast, I just zoomed to the bottom to see mangled body parts and orc corpses splatting on the bottom of the pit floor. Annoyingly, one of the orcs appeared to have survived the something like 150-meter fall and suffered merely a broken thumb. However, he was about to have the entire siege dumped on his head, and if the following bloodbath didn't kill him, at least psychologically, then my dwarves definitely would. We reset the pit, watched the next group of orcs attempt to cross, and then watched as they tumbled into the pit. As they hit the walls on the way down, the kinetic energy ripped them apart, so sometimes they came down in pieces. I think something similar might be happening when they bumped into other things, such as other orcs or maybe armor or whatever floating to the bottom, leading to some orcs surviving with only minor injuries. It was hard to say, but what we could say for sure was that the pit was extremely efficient. I closed the drawbridge and let the citizens wander. I sent a squad of dwarves out to deal with any stragglers who couldn't leave quickly enough. A war-trained cavehound and dire basilisk got to this one first, before being finished off by dwarves. We still had to deal with this guy, the lone survivor of the pit. He was pacing back and forth and really seemed like he was going through it. There wasn't any real danger, but I still gathered a full squad in the antechamber in preparation. Once the kill order was given, it only took moments to execute, literally. And after that, I had a look at the loot. Oh my lord, the loot. Most of what the orcs brought with them was, unfortunately, too big for us. The non-dwarf citizens could choose the best bits. We could melt some of it down and then sell the rest, but ultimately we'd have to forge our own armor in the end. Luckily, we had dug around a little bit and discovered that our sole marble deposit was actually split by a vein of gabbro, and there was plenty left. Unlike a 16th century Spanish aristocrat about to tank the European economy with surplus amounts of gold, and more like a decolonizing Middle Eastern nation in the 1960s about to make a big move, we planned to keep this precious steel all to ourselves, as we appeared to be some of the only people in the world making it. The entire time that siege was happening, my military squads were still training. The pit wasn't necessarily a way to avoid fighting, we still wanted to do that in the future, but a way to slowly attrit the enemy and amass tediously enormous piles of loot. Speaking of loot, the orcs had brought something special: cold iron, and lots of it. Cold iron is a material from the world of Dungeons & Dragons, forged at low temperatures and, according to the author of the mod, deals extra damage to fiends and fey creatures. It was otherwise statistically identical to iron, but we could probably melt down like 150 to 200 ingots of cold iron from what we now had. By now we had also raided the orcs enough that we had dozens of their war animals, and had already put them in combat. Chief among these were the crystalline chargers, goat-like creatures with crystal horns and milk that granted immunity to spells. No wonder the orcs seemed so resilient to the more magical civilizations nearby. They had to be met with steel because magic just wouldn't work. Zokunushrir was thriving now. With our insanely deep pit trap completed, we were producing so much, training so much, so singularly focused on refining our strategy that sometimes we hardly noticed when the corpse piles filled up or drinks ran out. And although I had started eliminating coal-based smelting in favor of magma, I refused to move the fortress any lower, so dwarves would unfortunately have to travel 125 Z levels just to make steel. In retrospect, the time spent moving the fort or chopping down trees would have been far less than the time wasted waiting for dwarves just to walk, so I would not recommend doing this. Autumn was beautiful, and I spent a little time assigning war animals again. I wish there was a way to equally divide and assign all unassigned war animals, starting with the highest trained soldiers, but I'm pretty sure even in version 50 this is still one of the most tedious things to do in the game. Looking up a dwarf, figuring out if they're good, going to the menus, assigning the animals. Yeah, I don't know, maybe there's a way to script that. Anyway, I was about to enjoy another gorgeous season of micromanagement in the winter of 113, but this wasn't to be. I had figured their recent total defeat at the Siege of Threatening might perhaps sway some of the orcs to stay away, but instead they showed up with a larger army, with more war animals, and with better arms. I mean, we hadn't even finished mopping up the blood from the last siege, but here they were. One of the orcs and an overland troll, as opposed to an underground troll, dashed in and attacked a few of my animals meandering outside. We still managed to get everyone else in, though, and we readied the pit trap for another total victory. The pile of gore on the pit trap floor was already unfathomable, but the orcs didn't stop coming. Eventually, as Dwarf Fortress develops, the bar that defines challenges like this will raise and enemies might get smarter about avoiding these kinds of things, but for now I was absolutely gleeful watching it happen as it did. Eventually, the orcs suffered enough losses that they panicked and began to retreat. I let the ones up above go since I really only had one squad armed and ready. There were stragglers to deal with though, including a troll that wandered back down, apparently lost I guess, and a couple more survivors in the pit. Then, I yoinked all the dead orcs items and melted down anything we could, which was a lot more this time. Absolutely incredible. This was the year I've been waiting for, working towards all this time. The signs of our industry were everywhere. This was not a small map, but we'd already clear-cut most of the trees and mined most of the marble, at least as far as I could tell. By exploiting the vast gold and galena deposits under our fort, we had also made our friends very rich. We had more than 5.5 million dwarf bucks of value in the fort, about a quarter of which was in legendary furniture, and about a third in the legendary steel arms and armor we'd been making for years. And we needed it. By now, out of 121 residents, 90 were enlisted, including our nobles, who were nearly as well trained as the rest. With nothing stopping us, it was time now to continue our retaliation against the orcs. We had to be careful about the place we chose to hit. The bigger population centers scared me, but as I found out before, the smaller places might not have anything but feral trolls. I chose to attack Maligned Ward, a medium-sized settlement about a day's travel away. It's worth noting that one of the immigrants living in Zokunushrir was a half-orc, a somewhat neurotic fighter who was part of the fort's most elite squad at the moment. Their name was Lick-the-Thinkum. Half-orcs often found themselves in conflict with their cultural identities, torn between the ravaging orcs and the industrious humans. Judging by the high status she ended up earning, I'd say she admired our strict ethics and unerring crusade against the orcs, who were a source of personal sadness and shame, as well as unjustifiable death, and so she joined up with the dwarves to fight. 2 weeks after giving the order to raise Maligned Ward, our dwarves returned. Unlike last time, this fortress was not empty. In fact, it was absolutely full of animals and orcs, including more than 300 crystalline chargers, adding weight to my theory that the orcs were using them for their magic-resistant milk. Trolls, deep stalkers, cave hounds. Our dwarves had spent 15 years learning how to fight and train these themselves, and they proved no challenge. Satisfied with their bloodshed, the squads returned to Zokunushrir to make this report. Confident now that we were doing damage, I sent 2 more squads to another orcish settlement, Ruthless Blush, with an estimated population of about 30. It was a brisk walk to Ruthless Blush, but my dwarves were even more effective than last time. The spoils were modest, and there were no animals to be found, so I'm guessing this settlement was only recently set up. That autumn, the orcs hit us back. The attack came only days after my squads returned, so I figured that it had been planned for a long time, but actually the group looked tiny. Who would even dare to come to Zokunushrir with such a puny army? So we decided to face them in open combat, gathering at the edge of the clearing, ready to meet the orcs. As they emerged from the trees, they clashed. An archer loosed arrows, but my dwarves dodged every single one. The slaughter was so violent, I caught a glimpse of severed limbs landing in the trees. But there were no survivors, and even better, no dwarven casualties. As the dwarves headed back inside, I gazed at the map of my enemies in a trance of hatred. Where would I hit next? And would doing so finally stop the flood of useless equipment and corpses into my fort? Well, you know, all you can really do is try. We had some difficulties taking out orcish settlements, but so far we've been overwhelmingly successful, thanks to our extensive military training. Year 16. We fought another smelly alligator, went through the menu-intensive but worthwhile process of freeing some animals we'd been draining, and we got a number of visitors that we didn't often see. In fact, there's a lot from this mod pack that we didn't get a chance to see in this playthrough, but that's just how Dwarf Fortress goes sometimes. We're just a tiny part of this massive world. Speaking of which, I'd been flirting with disaster by sending so many raids abroad, and it finally came back to bite me. 2 squads of dwarves got captured. They weren't my best trained, but still more skillful and better geared than any orc. More than a dozen comrades, lost to what our intelligence had reported was a small settlement. Unfortunately, there was nothing we could do for them at this point in the game, owing to a bug. And to be quite cynical, lots of people wanted to come to Zokunushrir, and now was their chance. Trading was lucrative, free time was plentiful, except for the mandatory conscription, and the rest of our raids went more or less to plan. Yes, fuck 'em up. Yeah! If it weren't for textual descriptions of violence breaking out unpredictably, Zokunushrir could even be a popular vacation spot on the savannah, a nearby retreat from the dwarvish mountains. But no, this place was still too enormous and too savage. As always, the most dangerous enemy is hubris. Or, I guess a cloud of deadly dust is sort of bad too. I'd come to expect orcs in the spring, and since they didn't seem to be sending huge squads, despite being allowed to do so, I figured I'd keep churning them up above ground. Some of the dwarves had been yearning for a fight like this their entire lives, and I was anxious to give it to them. I'd stationed 2 squads of archers within sniping distance of the enemy, and set the rest into combat. Just like last time, the carnage was so brutal it spread into the trees. It was a sight that shocked even seasoned military dwarves. We took casualties which, however trivial, would still have ripple effects throughout the fort. But almost like a living organism, the fort replenished itself. Our exploits against the Orcs continued with some surprising results. Holy shit, that's metal. We'd shifted our strategy from all-out murder to occupation, and it seemed like the new brand of warfare and politics was paying off in other ways. New settlements were forming nearby, inspired by our powerful economy. These were more dwarves from our civilization, the Twilight Arches. The world map was starting to get crowded, and I could have been wrong, but it seemed like the Orcs were expanding just as quickly as we were taking them over. Maybe new settlements formed by the Orcs that we kicked out. Distressing. After each successful takeover, I sent a messenger to retrieve all the dwarves, and after a brief reshuffling of positions, we went in again. The world was becoming quite politically complex, and these raids were becoming somewhat delicate in their bugginess, forcing me to save and restart recording after each one just to be safe. Mostly I've been focused on conquest in this abridged series, but the dwarves' lives are obviously a little more rich than that. As soon as we got the pit completed, I felt secure enough to open the tavern up to visitors. And we got visitors from all over the world: drow, scions of the saw, humans, half-orcs, dragon people. I couldn't even keep track of them all, and we didn't even see everyone. Most of them seemed like warriors, or at least that's what they said. I'd also begun courting our queen, so to speak, through trade deals in an attempt to elevate Zokunushrir's feudal standing, and maybe even convince her to move in, making our now formidable fort the Mountainhome. Many of our dwarves were descendants of the queen, Tosid copperships, and they treated her almost like a religious figure, making many statues and figurines depicting her ascension to the throne. Maybe if we could maintain the front against the Orcs, that would help convince her as well. Our fort, a tiny bastion in a wild world. Stray tame monsters wandered freely outside. Relics of battles from years past still dotted the landscape, too tedious to pick up. Rotted bones, shattered armor, worn-out weapons, lots of individual bolts and arrows, stuck in trees or half buried in the dirt. We also had forgotten beasts stuck in our basement. All of these were reminders of our history. The dwarves of Zokunushrir lived to fight, but for some their best days were behind them. I decided to retire a few dwarves from service, honorably discharged. We weren't a young fort, so dwarves thankfully weren't dying of their wounds anymore, but it did still slow them down. The war against the Orcs was going full tilt, and by now it was more fun to actually meet them on the battlefield directly. Watching these videos back in fast motion while editing is truly uniquely satisfying. Depending on how I was feeling at the time, I would either use DF hack to delete the absurd amount of useless gear and severed body parts, or I would just leave the detritus right where it lay. I was almost tempted to build a road into the fort and line it with corpses on pedestals. Instead, I wasted an insane amount of time building a rail track down to the magma forges that actually sucked and didn't work at all. I just want to repeat my advice from another episode. Don't split up your fort like this and force dwarves to walk back and forth. Doesn't work. After I finished making bad engineering decisions, I celebrated another in a long series of conquests. Ooh, let's fucking go! And prettied up the new guild halls and shoddy tavern with some artifacts. I was expecting visitors soon. I had been diligently offering up high-quality Electrum goods year after year to our queen. There was no way she could refuse moving to Zokunushrir, a powerful barony exporting, exclusively items in her image. How long did I have to wait? I wasn't really sure. By now it was year 20, and I was nearing the end of my intended campaign. So I finished up trading and figured I could spend a little time cleaning up maybe. But winter came and went as I waited for Queen Tosid to heed our offerings. There she was, Tosid Zokunushrir, or Tosid Copperships, Queen of the Twilight Arches, had finally arrived, bringing with her enough migrants to bring us to near 220 dwarves. Tosid was an average dwarf, with an above-average personality, capable of handling stress, full of compassion for her fellow dwarves, and deeply aware of all her flaws. She was a proper crafts dwarf, a bookbinder, and even though she'd had plenty of time to craft a masterwork of her own, she hadn't yet. She'd had 11 children throughout her long, long life, a couple of whom were actually here in the fort already. And would you look at that? She loves our bridge. Indeed, the pit trap is our finest construction. I began carving out the chamber that we'd expand into the Queen's throne room, but then, as if on cue, I got an alert. Orcs were coming over the hill from the north. I don't think they knew Tosid was here yet. It seemed like just a routine attack, but now I was incredibly eager to demonstrate the power of the pit trap, if not the power of our massive military as well. I called everyone back inside, into the tavern, which was now admittedly pretty crowded. Above, the orcs trod closer and closer, over the corpses of their comrades, the most recent to fail an invasion of this new Mountainhome. As usual, I ordered a squad of dwarves to stand ready to take care of any stragglers that came through. Hell, maybe I should let them, just to put on a good show for the Queen. Up above, the bloodthirsty orcs encountered some stray animals, chiefly a magically animated suit of armor that we'd captured in the caverns. One-eyed mage orcs, Eyes of Grumsh, cast spells upon the other orcs to buff them for battle, and half of them chased it around while the other half proceeded on into the fort. As they waltzed unknowingly over the bridge, the mechanic pulled the lever, and everyone in the tavern watched. With a loud clunk, some raspy screams, and the rattle of armor tumbling off of stone, the first group of orcs plummeted to their deaths. We threw the lever again, and soon the next group was doing the same. One brave orc started to scale the wall across, gave up, but then got stunned when the bridge suddenly popped back up under his feet. Nevertheless, his squad went into the pit as well. Up above, the now injured suit of armor was still leading a few orcs on a chase through multiple small murky ponds in the area, perhaps trying to drown them. When it looked like no more orcs were coming down, I sent a few squads up to deal with the stragglers, and maybe rescue the suit of armor. But it turns out the armor, although injured, was actually kicking pretty serious ass just by itself, taking on 4 orcs while my dwarves chased down some others. I was thoroughly impressed with how the invasion was handled, and so was Queen Tosid. This was the true Mountainhome, the true front against the orcs. Here, Zokunushrir. With the fort secured, the most important thing now was finishing the Queen's chambers. I moved the Baron's chambers downstairs so the Queen could be on the main floor, and then I lined the floor with cobaltite, electrum blocks, and olivine, decorating exclusively with the finest electrum furniture. Tosid inherited 2 of our finest artifacts, a native gold weapon rack and a native gold armor stand, one depicting the founding of Siegequakes, the other depicting the ascension of Tosid herself to the throne 120 years ago. And now, she was here, eating her plump helmets and admiring their craftwork. I had finally achieved what I set out to do more than 100 hours of gameplay ago. But was that the end?